As Ron mentioned, and as everybody knows, the Pacific Northwest region had a long and arduous fire season in 2017. Across our region, which covers Oregon and Washington we had 3,275 fires burn just over 1.12 million acres, almost 1.2 million acres of forest and grasslands across all ownerships. Of those, a total of 1,961 fires were in Oregon and burned approximately 710,000 acres across all ownerships. We spent 40 days at the highest preparedness level, meaning all available resources were committed. During peak activity, more than 10,000 firefighters and support personnel were working on fires in the Pacific Northwest region. Human-caused fires comprised nearly 62% of the fires in the Pacific Northwest across all ownerships. For us in this state, we burned approximately 750,000 acres on National Forest System lands, which is higher than what we typically experience. An inordinate amount of fires this year burned west of the Cascades. After a very wet winter, as Ron alluded to, we had a fire season that was predominantly fixed in the west, on the west side of the region, and at higher elevation with the early season or mid-season lightning storms that came through. We experienced a lot of fire starts in difficult to access terrain, wilderness areas, roadless areas, that became the problem fires for us as the season progressed. Overall, we had within the region about a 96% initial attack success rate across all ownerships, which is about our average year in, year out. Long durations across the region included the Diamond Creek fire in northern part of the Okanagan Wenatchee that spread north into Canada, and then the Miller Complex on the Rogue River Siskiyou that spread south into California. Here in Oregon, we had long duration fires on the Umpqua, Willamette, and Mount Hood National Forests as well. Unusual fire activity we encountered in Oregon this year included on the Eagle Creek fire in the Columbia Basin, or Columbia River Gorge National Scenic Area. This fire spread 13 miles in 16 hours. Much of that during the night, and jumped Interstate 84 as well as the Columbia River to spark the Archer Mountain fire in Washington. That's not our typical fire behavior. The Chetco Bar fire made a 6-mile run in one burn period and was igniting spot fires 1.5 miles to 4 miles in advance of the fire. And the Chetco Bar fire was the largest fire in Oregon this season. For fiscal year 17 fire season, nationally, the cumulative wildland fire costs, wildland suppression efforts again exceeded funding available. We spent approximately $2.4 billion, and with over 28,000 people supporting fires during peak western fire season. The other unique thing about this fire season is it started this time last year. We had overhead teams in the east dealing with the fires in the Appalachian Mountains in early October into November. And so we had basically a 24, it felt like 24 months, 12-month fire season, because after those fires in the east swung down to the southwest, and then it started in the typical fire season in the northwest, Rocky Mountains, and then Northern California. So our firefighters basically from all agencies have had very little break from a very intense fire season. As the season-ending events started to happen in October, we shifted gears and began to operate our burned area emergency response teams, completing assessments on over 700,000 acres region-wide, including over 500,000 acres in Oregon. We found from these assessments that approximately 9.5% of the fire that burned had a high soil burn severity, 26% burned at a moderate severity, and 64% saw low or very low severity burns. We also identified over $4.5 million worth of immediate post-fire response needs to mitigate risks to life, safety, and infrastructure. This impact obviously impacted communities, both in Oregon, Washington, and our surrounding area. It did have some benefits. That low severity burns, as Senator Barslager mentioned, had some benefits to mitigating high fuels and having a positive effect on the landscape. But the question is at what cost? Primarily what cost to fire suppression, as well as what cost to human health. The land management mission of the agency is critically important to the American people. We're taking necessary steps to ensure that we deliver our mission, including key land management activities to help reduce the fire risk. Right now, we're on a trajectory with our 10-year rolling average for fire suppression that is not sustainable, just like in the state of Oregon, and compromises all agency missions.
Jim, I'm going to have to ask you to
Yeah, with
wrap
that,
up.
I want to cut it off, and then
Yeah.
I'll take questions that will probably cover the rest of my presentation.
Right. Let me ask the first question. That is how we did this season in terms of injury. Our firefighters, how did they come out this year?
Well, I'll speak for the fires that we are responsible for. Within our region, we had no fatalities from firefighters. We had a lower level of serious injuries, and primarily those injuries were related to fatigue, traffic accidents or things like that. Nationally, we lost 3 firefighters in fatality incidents, 2 in Montana and 1 in California. And so for us, it was a better year, thankfully, than we've seen in other years.
Okay. Rip Witt? You have a
Thank you,
question
Mr.
there.
Chairman. Peter, you mentioned that there's been, in essence, a flip-flop in the cause of major stand replacement fires this year, from predominantly natural cause to predominantly human caused. It's difficult, maybe this year was an outlier, maybe it wasn't, but as policymakers, are there any suggestions of what we should be considering in terms of possibly changing human nature, human proclivities to reduce the number of ignitions that are human caused?
I think I'm going to sound like a typical bureaucrat. Resources is what supports prevention messaging. We did spend the extra resources across all agencies for the eclipse, since we know it works. Again, though, the flip-flop was only on ODF protected lands, not across all fires. So
Okay.
I'd want to think more about, before I recommended more investment in prevention relative to mitigation for high fuel risk.
Thank you.
So Rep. Springer, I'm sorry, I'm going to exercise a little House jurisdiction here, and since Rep. Brocksmith's district burned up more than anybody else's in my committee, I'm going to let him ask the next question or two, then come back to you.
Thank you, Chair. And Chair Clem and Chair Dimbrow, thank you for having this hearing as requested. I really appreciate it, so that we can have these discussions. Yes, out of the 750,000 acres that burned in Oregon, I believe, if anybody does the math, that's quite a bit of it was the Chetco Bar Fire at 191,000 acres. I just wanted to point out that ODF protected lands, when it comes to the Horse Prairie Fire, consumed a lot of your resources, as you had mentioned. That fire would have been detected by the incredible network that they have down there on those lands if it weren't for the smoke from the Chetco Bar Fire that did not allow it to be detected and kept under the 95% of the normal acres that are burned. When Senator Bearsugar was talking about the high intensity, as you know, Senator, because you've been over that fire scar area from the Biscuit and from the Silver, there is such a high intensity fire from those previous fires that there still is nothing growing in those areas because of that landscape. And the scariest thing with regards to we talked about the urban wildland interface earlier, and the fact that the Chetco bar fire moved at 6 miles at a time, as mentioned by the regional forester earlier. That fire is less than 5 miles from the city of Brookings as we speak, and yet there is 13,000 acres of matrix land there that is within the fire scar, but only 1,500 acres even being considered to be salvaged, and thus leaving this very snags that and fuel loads that started this fire in the first place, yet those snags and fuel loads are now 5 miles from the city of Brookings, rather than the, I believe, 13 or 14 miles that they previously were. With regards to the correlation, Senator Dembro, and the cap and trade argument and discussions, you know, when we have these fires, we know that 25 to 35% of the carbon is released through the fire, but then the other 75 to 65% is released over the 40 years that, even if we were to get that 191,000 acres, 1,500 acres of the 191,000 acres burned, that 190,000 acres will sit there and release its carbon over the next 35 to 40 years as it rots on the forest floor. And so as we move forward with the economics of all of this, knowing that it's going to be $33 million to the state, and knowing that 95% of the state, 95% of the fires that are on ODF protected lands are less than 10 acres, and yet we have this partnership with the federal government in, as it was stated earlier, mitigating high values from the regional forester, which goes to, I believe, Senator Bearsugar's argument of managing fire rather than fighting fire. My question, Mr. Pena, is what can the state of Oregon do to assist the federal government and the U.S. Forest Service, more importantly, in making sure that the 95 percentile that occurs on ODF protected lands is a target for the U.S. Forest Service lands within the state of Oregon, because the state of Oregon can no longer afford the economic partnership that we have in managing fire on federal land, not just with the $33 million price tag.
Representative,
Sorry.
let's do the question and then save the speech, and I want to hear his answer.
Sorry, not just with the $33 million price tag, but the economic development loss throughout because of the smoke. What can we do to assist USFS in making sure that, and then what can we do to assist the salvage from above 1,500 acres when we have 13,000 in matrix that is already scheduled to be harvested?